I'm sitting here with Dr. Karyn Esser. We've corresponded for a little bit. I've been trying to get you on to talk about circadian rhythms because a lot of my stuff is in tendons, and it's been kind of a recent thing with the circadian clock in tendons. But you've spent so long on circadian clocks. So, anyways, why don't you tell everyone who you are?
Oh, great. Well, it's great to be here, Jake. My name is Karyn Esser. I'm a professor in the Department of Physiology and Aging in the College of Medicine at the University of Florida. I'm a biomedical scientist. I've been studying skeletal muscle for a very long time, let's just say over 30 years. And I actually didn't start in circadian rhythms. It was sort of I call it the serendipity or the fun accidents of science when we started using some unbiased screens and found these clock genes in muscle. And this was in just early 2000s. And it was just kind of like, what the hell are these doing here? And just sort of the more I read about them, the more excited I got about the potential for the clock in skeletal muscle and ultimately other tissues to be part of what keeps muscle healthy and what helps muscle to adapt to increases in use and such.
Hmm. So, what is it? What is a clock?
Oh, what is a clock? Well, a clock is basically a molecular timer. So it's found in every single cell in your body, and it is conserved across our planet. So I don't care whether you're a plant or you're a bacterium or whether you're a fly or whether you're a human, you have a 24-hour timer in all of your cells. So this is something very, very well, and so from my perspective, when things are that conserved, that suggests they're going to be important. Okay. And so what this timer does is, it's evolved in our cells in concert with the fact that our planet rotates and we have periods of darkness and lightness, which for us corresponds to rest activity cycles, feeding fasting cycles. Okay. And so the clock's in there just keeping track of time. And I think of it as it's also going to work inside your cell and say, okay, we're not going to do all our jobs all at the same time, but we're going to do things like, so if I'm a muscle cell, I want to make sure all my metabolic pathways are primed and ready to go before I wake up, not after I wake up. This is an anticipatory clock. So it's going to prep the system so that before you get out of bed, the metabolic components of your muscle fiber are ready to go. And then on the other end of the spectrum, at the end of the day, it's time to restock the shelves. So you've been using glycogen, you've been using different fuels. You probably got some, little areas where proteins are modified or damaged, or maybe your membrane or that kind of thing. And what's the best time of day to do that? While you rest. So in a very simple sense, what this timer is doing is saying, okay, I want you to be doing, metabolism before you wake up. I want you over here to handle restoring fuels. Let's check things for damage sites. Let's repair. Let's maintain. It's about time to switch out that myosin. Let's put a new myosin in there. That's going to all happen during your rest phase. And so this is coordinated. Okay. And that's one, sort of the visual image I have anyways, in terms of what the clock is doing. So it's regulating a lot of genes, but it's regulating them at time of day specific, for time of day specific functions.
Hmm. And this is this something that just gets, how does this go wrong? The circadian regulation, what is like a
Mhm.
dysregulation?
Well, yeah, I mean, so there are, so the clock is, truly sort of what I would call an environmental sensor. So let's say you are, and so let's see, there are simplistically there are kind of two ways I can talk about how it can be modified in ways that could be problematic or pathological. One is the clock is very sensitive to what we call our time cues. So most everyone's going to be familiar with light as a time cue for our central clock. And especially those of us that live in states that do this, spring forward and fall back thing every year. And we have to adjust, our clocks have to adjust in response to these changes, artificial changes in our time. The reality is there's more than light that actually sets the clock, and what time we eat and what time we're active are two other sort of what I would call environment or behavioral factors that will talk to the clocks largely in the peripheral tissues, so liver, muscle, fat, heart, for example. And so if you have a person that has a regular sort of light and dark schedule, but they're a night eater, so they really do most of their eating sort of after 8 o'clock at night, then that tells the clocks in the periphery, you know what, I need to phase shift because this person's eating most and I've got to be able to manage handling that. And so now you have a situation where the brain clock stays in tune with the light cues, but this night eating is shifting your peripheral clocks. So within your whole body, you're basically creating a jet lag without traveling. So that what we call misalignment. So the timing of the clocks in the periphery are not in sync with the clocks in the brain. And so with that misalignment, you'll get some outcomes. I mean, A, you won't feel good, and your performance as an athlete is going to be diminished. But B, you'll start seeing things like increased circulating glucose, changes in mean arterial blood pressure. Not that it's going to kill you, but you're not going to feel great, right? And you're not going to perform well.
Mm-hmm. And do you think this, so like the peripheral clocks you look at mostly muscle, do you think this is happening in all the musculoskeletal tissues? This
So I will say so yes, for those below the neck. There is, nobody's actually taken on trying to look at, what happens to the masseter muscle, what happens to all these facial muscles. They have a slightly different developmental origin, and therefore they're, the nerves that serve them. They still have very common features, but there could be a potential where they could be getting some more communication, let's say, from the central clock. That I don't know. But I would say everything below the neck, I'd feel pretty confident saying, yeah, they all are responding. And they also, the other one, just real quick, is time of exercise. That's probably where my lab is more focused rather than time of feeding. But time of exercise can play a role in shifting clocks around in the muscles as well.
So these are the three things are the light, correct me, the light, the feeding, and the exercise are the things that are gonna.
Yeah, so those are the time setting modifications. The other thing, when you ask me about how clocks can go wrong, infection. So if you have, if you're sick, if you have inflammation, that inflammation can actually function to dampen the clock. So a lot of chronic diseases, type 2 diabetes, a variety of diseases have an association with increased inflammation. And what those will do is they'll just kind of like sit on the clock. It still works, but it's just not working as well.
What do you think if you have some inflammation or infection and your body wants to get rid of it, what does it serve that it would dampen? Is there any utility of that?
That's a great question. What's the value of dampening the clock systemically? This is wild speculation. This isn't even like educated speculation, really. But I would say, what it's doing is this body's got to deal with the infection as a primary. And so it can't be worrying about whether, your pancreas and your muscle are aligned and, all that kind of stuff. So it just sort of, that I'm not sure that's true, but that's, what the sort of like takes the clocks offline a little bit while the body has to deal with the challenges with it, whatever is going on with the infection.
Okay. Yeah, I've listened to, you've been on a few podcasts and watched the lectures that I can find. And this idea that the clocks are preserved on this 24-hour timer. So when things go wrong, they're still preserved. They're just dampened. They have less magnitude. That's it.
Well, so yeah, so there's a little bit of we have to go a little bit into the weeds here. So there are two parts to the clock, or when I talk about the clock, especially as a physiologist, there's the timer part, which is fairly robust, and that just sort of keeps running. It's sort of, it's like the Energizer Bunny, just keeps on going. But the clock has another job, and that job is to regulate a program of gene expression, as I sort of talked about earlier, which has a temporal component, but there are sets of genes that need to be regulated at certain times. So in disease, when the clock goes wrong, when inflammation dampens it, the timer works just fine, and that keeps ticking. But what happens is its ability to regulate this time of day specific pattern of gene expression gets rewired in ways that that are problematic. Okay, so and this is also what happens with age, unfortunately. So the timer itself keeps going, but the ability of the timer to do the jobs in a healthy way can be modified.
The I think it was Michael Kerr, one of these tendon researchers in Denmark. He's
Yes,
had a
yes,
few
yes, yes. Very
he's
good.
had a few videos where he's talked about kind of these phases you're talking about in muscle, but he was talking about the building phase and the cleanup phase with tendon. And I guess you look at what the cells are doing to collagen, and there was also other work on fibrosis, like laying down excess connective tissue. And I
Hmm.
was like, do you in your head would that be like a dampening where maybe the cleanup phase of the tendon is not occurring and you're just accumulating collagen. The cells are just continuing to kick it out.
That's very possible. I think we don't know as scientists. That's actually not been directly tested. But I think, when I think about the clock, I've started to call it the soul of the cell. I mean, it's the caretaker, right? And if its ability to do its job is modified, that's when we start seeing and again, it's not like a square wave, all of a sudden you're dead, but our ability to clean up, our ability to build, our ability to handle stress, respond to stress. And I'm talking like I'm a cell. So my cell's ability to do this is just it's not as resilient. We can't do it. All right. And so yeah, what you just said would fit very well within one of that kind of a model.
Hmm. I think I first maybe everyone that is listens to things that are popular. I think Andrew Huberman talked a lot about the circadian rhythms. He probably brought it to most people's attention, but he
Hmm.
always talked about the light being the big thing. Light is going to set all the circadian clocks and everything. And I think you're one of the few that was kind of like these
Yeah.
peripheral clocks, the muscle ones, the muscle, the tendon,
Yeah.
all the peripheral tissues, they kind of operate independent of the light and the SCN.
Right.
What is the acronym? SCN is.
SEN, so it refers to a specific part of the hypothalamus, right? And so I will say Huberman's a neuroscientist. So we're scientists. We have our cultures, we have our bias, we have our silos, and historically the circadian clock mechanism is always is so when it was always in neuroscience because there's the light in the brain, and it's like everybody was like, yeah, that's how it goes. And again, when I started 25 years ago on this down this path, I had colleagues in the muscle field that told me I was not very smart about this, and because you're just no, that's just downstream of the SCN. That's not going to. So, you know, over the last 20 years, we've recognized that the peripheral tissues actually can do their own thing. The SCN will keep working. It's very much tied into light dark cycles. I would say I consider it the conductor of the system. So in many ways, the SCN I look at the SCN as the circadian behavioral controller, right? When do we wake up? When do we go to bed? Some level of feeding control, although in mice it's very robust, in humans it's less so. And so I think it's not a hardwired control at all, and I think there's plenty of data to demonstrate that. I think we don't know exactly what percent control the SCN has, and I come in it as whether it's for argument's sake, but it's just like show me the data. The data right now say that if I eat and I exercise way off cycle of light, a number, not all, but a number of the clocks in the peripheral tissues will follow my behavior rather than the light cycle from the SCN.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and it's not saying I kind of had a hard time understanding it, but I think you're still a fan of let's get the brain clock and the peripheral clocks all on the same page as much as you can. It's just
Yeah,
that the brain is not controlling. Like you can mess up the muscle clock by exercising in a different, even if the light cycle is right, right?
correct. Many different labs have shown that. So yes, for us to be healthy, we want all our clocks to be in sync. Nobody argues that. There is a clock in the SEN that's light sensitive. I don't argue with that. The only argument right now is how much control does the SEN clock have over the peripheral clocks? And on that topic, I would say that the SEN doesn't directly control the phase of the peripheral clocks. The
Hmm.
SEN may control things like when we go to sleep, when we wake up. So then when are we active, when are we not, those kind of things, but it's not a direct. So what I'm arguing is the SEN doesn't directly talk to my muscle fibers. Okay. And so what talks to the clocks and my muscle fibers is feeding and activity.
Yeah. And the feeding and the activity, they've tried to um I think in the tendon world, they're trying to figure out what is the perfect time of exercise, and they have no
Mm-hmm.
answer. And I've been really curious on their speculations, but I haven't received any of their insight. But I probably all the peripheral clocks, if you talk about liver, muscle, tendon, connective tissues, and things, it probably just makes sense that you have a regular exercise and a feeding time that would be like
Mm-hmm.
best for all of them. What do you think that is? What is the best time to exercise? What is the best time to eat?
Um, yeah, that's a it is. People are like, okay. So where I start with this question is I say, what's your goal? All right. So if I'm, me, as an older woman that just wants to stay fit, and wants to stay healthy, keep my system healthy, the first thing I say is exercise, please, dear God, exercise. The other thing is that so I generally am a morning person. So I historically have was a runner, field hockey player in the olden days, but so I am the kind that wants to get up and get going first thing in the morning. If I can run in the afternoon, but I feel like crap. Okay. So that still holds true for me. So my preference is, morning activity for this. Um, and that's a preference, but I think that's consistent with the clock system as well. Because now, if I was an athlete and I'm thinking about performance, there's no doubt you are stronger in the afternoon. And some metabolic studies are showing endurance is greater in the afternoon. Um, so there is, one, and if you look at the history of when world records are set, it's afternoon, early evening, right? And so what that would say is obviously for a performance, that would be a preferred time. But again, going back to what do you want with your training? So there's uh, we have some unpublished work that, and again, it's preclinical, so this is with mouse models, that you can train. So you can train in the morning, or you can train in the evening, or or late afternoon with the mice. Now, and they start at different performances. So the morning mice sort of perform here. The afternoon mice are better. They just have the capacity to go run farther and longer. Now, after 3 weeks of training, they both get better, but they're still different. After 6 weeks of training, somehow the morning catches up, which means in that last 3 weeks of training, they've actually had a greater adaptation than these afternoon runners. All right. Um, so so what that tells me is be consistent with when you train. Train during your active period. I would suggest it probably isn't a good idea to train at midnight unless that's when you can only do it and that's a regular routine. But I think the routine part is important. Don't train 8 a.m. one afternoon and 5 p.m. the next afternoon if you're wanting to get the most out of your training adaptations.
What about the feeding component?
The feeding component, my thinking on that is just I like to bundle them, right? So I think of them as, so obviously, well, I like food, but I like exercise too. And but I also see them as this, like, okay, they're going to talk to my clocks in the periphery. So I want them to reinforce each other, not be two separate. Now, I'm not talking about I have to eat immediately after exercise. No, the other part of this with the clock, it's not, the atomic clock with the high resolution. This is a kind of clock. And so when I think about, when I exercise and eat, I think about more like a 2 to 4 hour window rather than, you know, I finish my exercise and I got to down something, within 30 minutes. That part. Now, there are other people that think about that and study that, but from my perspective, that's in the clock world, that's not that important.
The I've always been I like eating at late at night.
Mm,
Um, I always have. I maybe it's the fasting. Like in the mornings, I just like to do
yeah.
caffeine, coffee or something. Don't eat anything, and then I'll eat quite a bit of food, maybe from like 8 to 10, and then maybe go to bed at 11 or 12. And I kind of was thinking, like, wouldn't that serve good to for your repair processes at night, or is that messing things up to eat very late?
Well, I mean, I mean, based on what I see, I mean, you look very healthy. I think that, so one of the questions where I'd start with this is, do you like getting up early?
No.
Okay. So there's a phrase, there's a term that we can define people by. It's called chronotype. What's your chronotype? All right. So there are actually some online sites you can take these tests. Basically, what the test will ask you about is, given, no external demands, when would you choose to go to bed? When would you choose to wake up? All right. So I'm going to guess you and I are opposite chronotypes. So I'm what would be a lark. So I never have used an alarm clock. I wake up probably about 5 in the morning. But when you're eating and having a good meal before you go to bed, I'm already going to bed, right? So I'm in bed asleep by 10 p.m. And so what we know about the difference in the chronotypes. So I'm a lark, so I would put you more into the owl category, is, you enjoy staying up late. And along with that, then to get your sleep in, that means you're going to have a later start time. There's genetic underpinnings. So what differentiates us is my clock runs at slightly less than 24 hours, so I have a little bit shorter period length. Your clock runs at slightly more than 24 hours. So when you think about designing, time of day, exercise, and feeding, it's going to be different for the two of us. All right. And I get it. So I don't eat anything in the morning either. I just sort of coffee, absolutely, but and so I start eating sometime between 10 a.m. and noon, and then I will stop eating sort of, well, I'll try to stop eating somewhere around 7 or 8, 7 o'clock, and then, with the bedtime. And so our styles may not be all that much different. It just reflects the fact that I'm an early morning person and you're more of a late person. So that's another nuance in all of this discussion as well.
Hmm. What about I've heard some things on caffeine. Obviously, you take it too late and you have different responses, but you take it too late and it will obviously make it harder to sleep. Is there anything else going on that could be messing up from a clock perspective? Is there anything about caffeine that does it, or is it just that it, yeah.
No, I mean, so caffeine activates, your sympathetic nervous system, and I, at least last I was studying it, there's no data that would say caffeine is then all of a sudden doing an acute phase shift in your clock. No, there's nothing to that. Um, so I think it's more that, so let's say you're doing something, you're tired, but you got to keep going, so you take in caffeine. And so again, what happens is that part of your nervous system overrides that intrinsic part of your clock that's saying, it's time to go to bed. It's time to go to bed. And so again, you can override what your clock is telling you. And caffeine gives you that opportunity.
So you're talking about mice earlier, and a lot of the research, the tendon research on circadian clocks was on mice.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was looking at okay, I don't know how true this is. Are they all nocturnal?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and so I appreciate you asking this because it can be very confusing. So almost all the people I know working on mice are strain of mice that are nocturnal. So yes, which means they get up in the dark and they do their sleeping primarily in the light phase. Most of their eating is 75% of their eating is in the dark phase. Um, that said, so one of the beauties about muscle is we do have studies that were done, to analyze circadian clock function in human skeletal muscle, because unlike tendon, muscle is biopsyable, and people are willing to give multiple biopsies to do this. And so what we've learned, what we've learned, bottom line is that the data in mice are absolutely translatable to the human condition, with the understanding that you compare things in the active period or the rest period, not in light and dark. So the kind of things that are going on in the dark phase of a mouse skeletal muscle are virtually the same as what are going on in the human skeletal muscle during the light phase. Okay. It's just, there's just a swap over. So, I think, yeah, I'll just stop there. So does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Another when I was getting into the circadian stuff, this was maybe a couple years ago. I was just watching a bunch of lectures, and there was one video just talking about reindeer that lived maybe in
Oh,
Alaska or somewhere where it would.
well, yeah, I think close to the Arctic Circle. Oh, I can't. Yes, I've seen some of these studies. It's very
Okay,
cool.
okay, yeah.
Hmm.
So, but they maintain this clock even with the sun being up for 24 hours or the sun there's no sunlight, and they maintain the clock, but it's really just based off of when they're active and when they're resting, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think obviously there are people that live in Norway. I mean, even the northern U.S. and Canada, there are periods where the light phase of the day is a lot shorter than let's say those of us that live down in Florida. And so I think one important point, I guess, that actually came to mind as you're saying this is we don't need light for our clocks to run. Absolutely do not need. So all the light is doing is it's doing adjustments, sort of a little, oh, maybe we need to move it a little forward, a little backward. The clock will run. So in fact, there are studies where humans have gone into dark caves, like Mammoth Cave, where you don't get any light and the temperature is the same. And that was one of the first human experiments I was aware of. It was somewhere in the 1940s. And everything still ran on a cycle. So it is really important for everybody to understand the clock's going to run inside your cells. It doesn't matter whether you get light or not.
When I think you've talked about this before, but when there's daylight savings time, how much
Mhm.
is that messing things up?
Well, I mean, so at this point, we've been doing this long enough. So the hardest is the phase advance or the spring forward. So when which we're coming into sometime in the next month or two. So when you advance the clock like this, there actually is quite a bit of data. So the day after that, you see the most visits to emergency rooms with coronaries or some kind of heart-related issue. On the road, there are more accidents, so people's either attention span or reaction time or something. So there, I mean, it really only lasts about a day as the systems start adjusting. But there is a lot of data now across the country that there is a real problem in our ability to adjust. Our system's not meant to adjust like that. It takes days to adjust to that. And the one in the spring or the spring forward, which is a phase advance, is more difficult. The phase delay, which is the one we do in the fall or fall back, is easier for the clocks to adjust to. And there's also the traveling east is harder than traveling west. It's based on the fact that our clocks have a harder time adjusting to an earlier setting rather than kind of sliding back to a later setting.
Hmm. I think you've brought this up before. I'm interested because I've heard a lot of anecdotes of people with tendon pain who drink a lot of alcohol and then they stop and their tendon pain will like resolve, feel much
Hmm.
better. But what is the effect of that on the clock?
Alcohol does have an effect on the clock, and that there's no doubt about it. And so I do enjoy a beverage now and then, but you just it's temporary. So it's not a permanent thing. But obviously, if you're talking about you know, I mean, I guess if the question is why stopping alcohol helps with tendon pain,
Yeah, not
um,
necessarily that. Not necessarily that. Just what is the effect of that? I just use that as a weird anecdote. But
it,
I was aware of it. I think is there an effect of that on affecting how the clock is working?
yes, there's no, yes. So alcohol can affect the function of the clock. And so if again, given room to speculate, then stopping drinking will let the clock do what it's supposed to be doing better and therefore improve the health of the tendon in that case.
Hmm.
I mean, was it that? I don't know, but that's
Yeah, yeah. You one of your lectures you had a video. I think it was a mouse like on a treadmill or something, and I think you had knocked out one of the circadian clock genes and the muscle kind of, I
oh,
think it wasted away, and then the Achilles tendon got a calcification in it.
yes.
Could you
Yes.
talk a bit about that?
Yeah, no, that was a really dramatic phenotype we had. So you're right. So we had a mouse model in which we had basically stopped the clock only in muscle fibers, and then we let the animals live as long as they could. And what we noticed was that we could tell in the cage that they were moving differently. So with a colleague, we generated a video putting them on a treadmill, and you could see that their back, sort of like thinking about when you push off with your foot when you take a step, they could not, you know, what we call plantar flex, or sort of point the toe. So they had to. So when they moved their back leg, all the movement had to come at the hip because it was like their ankle was fixed. And so when we went in to take a look, the tendon was calcified, no doubt about it, and it was pretty severe. And so why did that happen? Again, we targeted muscle, we didn't target the tendon. But what it highlights is the amount that these different tissues are talking to each other. And so there was something that went on in the muscle that actually triggered this response in the tendon.
Mm. Yeah, I've doing so much tendon rehab. I used to be so tendon focused, and now I'm much more on the muscle because the muscle gets wasted away, and it's like the tendon is just a dumb tissue that's going to respond to what the muscle's doing. So I feel
Well,
like,
that's a little harsh on your tendon, but
yeah,
I think that I actually I've come, I sort of I'd say I used to think like that, but I actually think the conversation goes both ways.
okay, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. Well, I guess I'm going away from the tendon thing because you have the pain there and you're always trying to change the structural properties. Whereas I'm
Hmm.
like, it's much easier to change the properties of a muscle because
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
yeah, it's so
That's
metabolically
absolutely.
active
Yep.
and the blood flow and exchange and everything is just so much more controllable. And the muscle usually gets really wasted away. So it's like maybe if we optimize the muscle health, the tendon can kind of just go about its healing process much better. But what do you think is that communication between the muscle and the tendon that would cause some calcification?
Well, I mean, so our best guess is that the muscle released factors that had an impact on the cells in the tendon and sort of, created some either whether lineage changes or uh, okay, I'll be real honest. I don't know what triggers calcification in a tendon. So what the molecular pathway would be, I would defer to experts in that space. But we did identify a number of factors that are different in the muscle in which the clock stopped that could then have an impact. So if they were released from the muscle, that's what we think is that this is a release from the muscle to the tendon, and then those factors then inform cells in the tendon. In this case, the response is calcify. Now, there could be, an alternative or a sort of complementary idea is that the muscle got really weak. And so with the muscle that weak, you need us, and maybe it was like, okay, we got to fortify the structure here so that the animal can use this leg. And so, there could be some of that kind of communication as well.
Um, I've been trying to find an answer. Yeah, I really doubt you'll have anything, so don't feel bad. But the birds, so like there's work on birds and their
Hmm.
tendons, like turkeys, they
Hmm.
calcify naturally. And yeah, I don't know if you've seen this. Why would something like calcify naturally? Is it just that they need something so stiff? Their body knows they need something so stiff. Like in the case of the mouse muscle going bad,
Yeah,
they need,
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, it could be something like that. So one of the things I do, this brings back some old training I had when I was a graduate student. The energy store, as you know from talking to the people you've talked to, energy storage in the tendon is really important. So when we look at walking and running, and things like turkeys have given us data in this space that the amount of work the muscle does and the length excursion is actually quite small. And it's just so when you land, you store, and I mean, you do need some to help convert to push off, but those tendons become critically important, especially in some kind of in mobility, right? I mean, you can think of, kangaroos too. I mean, that their tendons are huge. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I could imagine that, when you look at the musculature of these things and you think about, okay, for survival, what's important? Keeping the structure fixed, then we can get rid of mobility. We don't need all that mobility. Let's just fix it and fly off.
Yeah,
So,
that no, that makes a whole lot of sense because that video of that mouse is like such a stiff, that leg did not have
oh,
mobility. Yeah.
no, I mean, honestly, we could you had to break the ankle basically to get it to point its toe. I mean, not that we did that. Okay, I want to be real clear, but you would have to.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we talk about this, all of these circadian clocks and everything's has these two phases basically. When you start aging, what
Hmm.
happens when you age? When does this like kind of take hold that aging makes a big effect on the clock?
When exactly when we don't again we don't know for sure. So the work that we published just over a year ago, we looked at aging clocks in muscle and a variety. We actually in six different tissues in a mouse and in a male mouse. We'll say there's some sex specific differences. The clock itself, going back to that actual timer, is fine. It seems to run just fine by and large. But it's that second part, the ability of the clock to regulate time of day specific gene programs, it changes. And it changes in ways so I would say in the muscle and in the brain, the changes are very apparent by what I would call middle age of the mouse. So it has changed before middle age. So when exactly, and I don't know, and again, then the change from middle age to old is even more dramatic. But the fact that it's changing by middle age is telling us these things are happening earlier, right? Now, these mice were maintained sedentary, I will say. So, one of the things that we are interested in actually running a study right now is if we let them be active, how much can we keep that clock function throughout the life? And that's I'm sitting here, yes, please. So that's actually a study that's ongoing right now.
Mhm. And the exact problems of aging, is it, so I've kind of looked at it with the tendon. If we talk about the building and the cleaning phase, I'm just like, is it just that when you're aging, the building phase is less robust and the cleaning is less robust? Is that kind of,
So there's some of that. So it again, it's not doesn't fall into a simple story, but what it's that maybe you don't clean as much and maybe you don't build as much, which is sort of what you're saying. But also, what you start seeing is the time alignment of these things. So let's say classically, you sort of have, active phase and you have the different jobs in active phase and rest phase. Now that gets a little murky. Some of these things start showing up at different times. So you don't have that fine temporal resolution that you had that you when you're younger. And so again, we don't, so why is that? So this is, again, there's a lot of research going on. It's like, well, you've got this that's still running. Why is it having problems doing this other job? And so that takes very in-depth analysis. And so I don't have the answer for that. But it's, again, with most things in biology, it's not going to be simply one thing. Otherwise, we would have an elixir for life. So
yeah. Um, when you're spending all this time looking at muscle, when there's, I don't know if you've ever done this, when you get a muscle injury, like a muscle strain, what is, I don't know if you have anything on this, is what happens like in that region of the muscle and the
Hmm.
clocks that exist there.
So yes, you're touching on something that we are very interested. I've got a postdoc in my lab that actually has just started looking at the interaction between uh, sort of an eccentric exercise damage protocol and what happens to the clocks in that region. And along with that, are there time of day sensitivities to injury, right? So are you more prone to injury like in the afternoon, or in the morning, or that kind of thing. And so I guess I'm going to say stay tuned. We don't I mean literally it has just started, so I don't even have any data to speculate with at this point.
Mm, yeah. When you okay, so that's the aging and the mice. You said you kept them sedentary.
Hmm.
I'm wondering if when you get injuries, muscle injuries or tendon injuries, probably more so with the tendon injury, it's not as common now, but immobilization, just resting that limb completely, what, because you're removing exercise in that region, what is that doing to the clocks that exist there?
The clocks will still run. So inactivity doesn't stop the clocks. But again, and if it's only 1 or 2 days, it probably won't have a large impact. But, if you've got somebody immobilized for weeks or months, that's another situation. And so um, I think I think that so the fundamental observations we've seen so far is that immobilization is not going to stop the clock. In fact, that again, going back to the concept like I was with aging, that timer keeps running. But where the problem comes in going from the timer and getting the right sets of genes at the right time regulated. And I would predict that this is going to be the same problem with sort of immobilization or inactivity. I think the activity is, there's lots of reasons it's good, but part of it is it we do have some data is that it does enhance the ability of the clock to go from being the timer to what it's doing here. And so right now that would be my expectation.
Yeah. Yeah, there was I was reading some on I think it was on the Achilles and they did like if you go into space, maybe
Mm-hmm.
they had bed rest or something and they
Mm-hmm.
saw the tendon was much I don't know if it got smaller, but it got much less stiff. And then it was I think Peter Magnuson had some work on immobilization for 2 to 3 weeks and you saw like an 80% reduction in collagen synthesis. And these
Mm-hmm.
are coming from the cells. So I'm thinking like, do the cells just have no reason to kick out collagen because they're getting no mechanical loading? And yeah, that's what I would think there.
That I would agree. And how much of that is coupled to the clock during those periods of building and recovery. I don't nobody's really I don't think asked yet
Hmm.
or tested.
Um, in the feeding time, have you seen anything with people that do prolonged fasting? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there was actually going back to the feeding thing and aging in particular. There is a group in Texas, Joe Takahashi's group in Texas has shown that if with mice, if so you'd put all so one of the things with aging is caloric restriction. So eating less with most organisms, humans we're not quite sure because it's so hard to do. Actually helps extend lifespan. What Joe's group showed is it's not just eating less, it's actually the time in which you eat. So that again, going to this time restricted feeding. So he had animals all had the same amount of food, but then they allowed them to eat in different patterns over time of day. And they found something like a 20 to 30% increase in lifespan if the animals only ate the food they got during their active phase. Now, when you do this time restricted feeding, or with humans, time restricted eating, there obviously is a fasting phase. I'm not of the I'm not in the category that I think fasting for multiple days is a great idea. Does it do harm? Probably not with us. I mean, there are very few people that look like they're gonna not make it after 2 days of fasting. But I think, again, thinking about the time cues that are reinforcing some of the biology in your body, to me, getting some regular food again during, middle of the day, whatever is the window for you that works is actually a benefit. And so I'm not sure that all these multi-day fasts are actually a good thing.
Hmm. So we were talking before we got on about I find all this research and I love the photos they have of the how bad Achilles tendons look or how bad muscles look or something, and it's you'll knock out a certain circadian gene, like
Mm-hmm.
completely knock it out. But I've always been like, okay, it's great to see this extreme, but does it help at all for like maybe what could be happening in a human? Because we're not really knocking out. If we knocked out a gene, would we die or what would happen?
No, well, no, I mean, it depends on the gene.
Yeah.
It depends on what tissue. So, so yeah, I mean, no doubt, the knockout animals are I call them. I mean, they're useful as a scientist because you can control something, and these days we can target what cell type, what age are we going to do this. So there's a lot of really useful information we can gain from this. But the reality is, you're right. I mean, there's no human walking around with a B-male knockout just in their skeletal muscle. That just doesn't. That's just not feasible. Um, but what does it do? It tells us the extremes. So one great example is when we stop the clock in muscle. One of the problems in the muscle is it can't use glucose very well. So the muscle becomes insulin resistant. Its ability to use glucose through glycolysis is severely reduced. And so what that makes the muscle tissue have to use fats and to some extent amino acids or proteins as its fuel source. And then what results systemically is you have sort of a pre-diabetic state. Now, as I said, we don't create a B-male knockout in humans, but what we have seen is that when we intentionally make clocks misaligned in humans, so there are experimental ways to mess with, central and peripheral clocks, those people become insulin resistant in like within 7 days. Okay. And these are, like I call them the generic healthy young male. So these are sort of the 20 something healthy, go in for, participate in a research study. They're in the clinic for 35 days, or something like that. But they, I think, made them live on a 28-hour day, which doesn't sound terrible. So, instead of having 12-12, they were on a 14-14. But after 7 days, they were showing signs of high glucose levels, insulin insensitivity, and additionally, the regulation of their blood pressure started to go wonky. So those kinds of studies have been consistent with the extreme conditions we see in the mouse model. So it's obviously not as bad in the human with that. And unfortunately, when they go back to their regular living conditions, things go right back in sync. But it illustrates that, the health of the muscle, because they've all now done and shown, some of the muscle issues in these humans, and the health of the clock system in the muscle in the system actually are contributors to features that we would call metabolic disease.
Mm. This makes me think of I guess when I was an undergrad, I just started looking into a lot of the chronic diseases we get. Maybe it was like the
Mm-hmm.
why zebras don't get ulcers, Robert's, all these things we're dying of. And it seemed like
I didn't
everything
know
was
that. So anyway,
the everything it would seem like type 2 diabetes was kind of behind a lot of things like chronically hypoglycemia
yeah.
causing a lot of issues. So when you talk about feeding kind of having this signal, is it sugar? Is it the glucose that's
Uh,
doing it? Or like if you're eating proteins and fats, like a ketogenic diet, is that what's going on?
Yeah, I think right now there's some data that would point to insulin. So in response to feeding, the changes in insulin may be part of the cue. I don't know. There may have been one or two studies that pointed to glucose, but I don't think that is considered the major time cue. More it's going to be sort of the hormonal signals, the insulin signals that's coming from the feeding.
Yeah, okay. And you're gonna get that anytime you eat anything.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so this before we got on, I was referencing this. I think it's only one study on it was patellar tendon group with well, maybe they had the same person, one healthy tendon and one was the unhealthy one, and they looked at the some of the circadian genes, and they saw that the healthy tendon had this robust. I think it was like the MMPs were cleaning up the tendon at a certain time, and then they were getting collagen synthesis at a certain time. But the tendinopathy side, it was like I read it, and I probably am misinterpreting that the cleanup phase was kind of just not going on.
Hmm.
And I'm like, is it, maybe you could speculate on this. Was it something that had happened before that like there was something wrong with the tendon with the way that it was building and cleaning up, and then this turned into a tendinopathy, or is it like the tissue was injured and now the circadian clock is kind of showing these negatives?
Yeah, these are chicken egg kind of questions, and you know, I think at this point, obviously with humans, it's very hard to tell. But what can we say from this is that just disrupting the clock alone is sufficient to do that. Okay. And when you're talking about cleaning up, I always think, so I'm a Chicagoan by heart. So what I always, when I started getting into circadian rhythms, I always thought about, you know, in Chicago, you had to worry as much about garbage pickup as you did about anything else. Right. And so in the body, not only do you have to build stuff, but you got to clean up the stuff. And it is absolutely important. And this is true in muscle as well. And so we know if we disrupt the clock, we can cause those problems. Now, that said, you know, so if there could there be some damage that then leads to some of the problem, you know, some of the problems with the cleanup, and a secondary effect is the clock is affected? Sure, that can happen too. And so, you know, again, these are going to be hard cause and effect questions to address in a human, and this is where the preclinical models will help us.
So, last one I got for you here. I think this is enough confusing stuff for me for now. We'll have to do another one, and I'll have more questions. But the people, I just deal with a lot of people with tendon issues, and they're worried about. I started posting quite a bit about circadian clocks because it was fascinating to me, and then people are always asking the practical application of what can they do to, I guess theoretically, keep their tendon clock or muscle, all of those
Uh-huh.
tissues. How do they keep the clock healthy when they're already healthy, or if they're injured? It's probably the same thing, but what would be your recommendation for how to keep this clock good as you go about life?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's what I do in my own life. It's just so I think about my activity patterns and you know my feeding behavior and sort of making sure that it's a priority. But and then you know, as I said before, I try to make sure that I keep them in a window of time that, you know, the information that I am imagining they're getting from my behavior is put to good use. And so what that means, like I said before, I'm a morning person. So generally speaking, depending on work and other things, I will be active somewhere between seven. I mean, I usually am not out there exercising afternoon for me. And then like as I said before, my feeding window usually is until about 7 o'clock. At this point, that's really all we know. Now, we are doing some of this. There are people out looking at small molecule modifiers of the clock and thinking about ways we can actually harness or leverage the clock for good. And you know, so for those people that let's say maybe can't exercise, or you know, can we identify ways we can go in and help support that system to really help support the tissue health, musculoskeletal health.
Hmm. I got one more for you, actually.
Hmm.
What are you most curious about right now in this space?
Um, Boy, it you know, so many things, so little time. I think I mean, I really, again, I sort of grew up thinking a lot about exercise and muscle adaptation. And I think one of the things, I'm kind of a biologist at heart. And so one of the things I really am fascinated by is how is the muscle clock. So the muscle clock is really quite necessary for that acute exercise response and therefore training responses. So how does that work? How is the exercise actually using the clock to generate the what we would call the healthy adaptations. And where can that go wrong? Can we actually identify ways, maybe it's because it's personal in an aging population, to boost that? But this could be true in a diabetic population or that. But I just, at the end of the day, I'm just fascinated how these things interact and how the system works.
Yeah. Yeah, mine, I'm still waiting for them to. What was their? It was like Tendo time or something. They were trying to
Oh,
figure what is the perfect time to. And
yeah.
there's nothing for me yet. I actually feel like it's gonna be my pessimism. I'm like, we're probably not gonna learn anything. And I also think maybe it's just gonna be the night owl and the early bird type thing.
Yeah.
Just extra.
No,
Yeah,
I mean, again, and then I come at this sort of as this person that really, there's wisdom in evolution, right? So the system's had a whole lot of years to figure stuff out. And so, it's, and again, this isn't, there's such a hard push for this precision thing, right? How much protein do you take in, how many minutes after exercise, and, et cetera, or, whatever you're doing to keep your tendons healthy. And I think we're getting to we're sort of getting to the asymptote where it's just going to be like, yeah, you can play with some stuff, but I don't know how much difference it's going to make. And I hate to be a naysayer, but some general principles are good. But are we going to find, the hour between 10 and 11 for me is like ideal? No, I don't think so.
yeah, yeah. All right, Karen, tell people where to find you online. I know you're on Twitter. Is that about it?
I
Or
yeah, I have to say I'm not so active on Twitter anymore. I have moved over to Blue Sky some. I am now a chair, so I've had a lot more responsibilities thrown on me, so my social media presence is a little bit diminished. I am available by email. You can just go to the University of Florida and look me up. And but happy to talk to people. And yeah, that would be it.
perfect. Thanks for coming on.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jake. Enjoyed it. Okay. Bye bye.